Okay. Well, welcome to our Pharma multi-channel marketing meetup, which is also always quite a mouthful to say. So this group, in case nobody knows, is it's all about it's for anyone working in the pharmaceutical industry interested in learning more about multi-channel marketing. And we offer presentations from channel experts from within and without the industry. And members are always encouraged to share best practice, case studies, and engage in group discussions, and particularly the Q&A at the end of our talks. I'll go through what the sort of order of play will be, so everyone has a good idea of what's been happening. But so we've been going since October 2018. This is our 15th event. We've got over 634 members. That translates to about 852 bums on seats since we started, and today we've got over 100 guests, which is fantastic. Today's topic is Behave, using behavioral science and Veeva CLM for remote selling excellence, I beg your pardon. And as we mentioned, we were talking in the chat earlier on, it's really about without having face-to-face and all that sort of dropping off a cliff, companies are struggling to fill that gap, and this talk's really going to be about finding the best way to engage so that your every engagement is premium and can drive the maximum behavioral change. So the order of play today is going to be, I'm going to start off with James Harper, who's co-founder of 28B, but he's also co-host of our Pharma meetup. We started it together. And he's a trusted Veeva CLM CRM expert, helping pharmaceutical brand teams, medical teams, and their agencies optimize their use of Veeva to better enable and empower the multi-channel rep for selling effectiveness. So he's going to be setting the scene for showing the COVID impact in our industry and customer expectations. And after that, we'll jump over to Dave Pinnington. He's marketing and behavioral science leader and founder of Markify. He's also a marketing behavioral science lecturer. So I'm very lucky to have him. And Markify is helping marketing become more effective with its unique service and tool that helps you plan, evaluate, and track your marketing effectiveness. And he's going to cover how to boost rep tools and content by applying behavioral science, which I can't wait to hear. It's going to be amazing. And then it's going to be back to James, and he's going to be talking to us about optimizing Veeva sales materials to enable and empower the multi-channel rep. And then right at the end of that, we'll get together for a discussion, some Q&A. So hold your questions, put them on the Q&A or on the chat. Preferably the Q&A is a bit easier, actually. We'll take note of those. If you've got it particularly to a person or to both speakers or even to myself, that's absolutely fine. And we'll answer those when we finish the whole thing. So I hope you enjoy, and over to James.
See if this all goes smoothly. So are we seeing the main slide? Yeah, great. Okay, so what I'm going to just do briefly is to give us all a bit of context, not that sure we're all very much aware of what's happened, but just a few stats and data around both what's happened in-house in terms of what our response has been to COVID, as well as some expectations from our customers, because that sets the scene for the importance of remote engagement. Let's try that again. I don't need to introduce this because Christy did a beautiful job of introducing us. But just rather than about 28B, where we're helping brand teams, just a bit of context for myself. I've been 27 years in the industry. I carried the bag for 7 of those years before moving into agency and in-house roles and set up 28B 10 years ago. And in the last 7 years, our focus has been Veeva. So we have a pretty broad view of the industry. We've got access to, I think now counting 14 Veeva vaults, so that's 14 different pharma company vaults, and we have another 5 or 6 that we don't have access to, but we are seeing what they're doing with content. So we've got a fairly broad view of the industry and what's happening, but also it's a particular area of interest for us. So what happened in 2020, no surprises here. This first slide I like for a number of reasons. It shows Veeva's quick response, but also the industry's quick response. So you're looking at what happened between in the first lockdown from March 9th and 15th to the following week, and you saw that sudden uptick in the number of meetings scheduled remotely with customers. No surprises there. But what I like about all of these stats I'm going to show you is that despite everything that was happening, our customers, the clinicians out there, still value the engagement with us as an industry. And we mustn't forget that what we do has value to our customers. So again, just a different view of that January to March 2020. No surprises, total number of calls dropped by 52%. Live events even further But what's really interesting is the approved emails sent went up by 263%, and that startling increase in engaged meetings. But just for context, as an industry, responded quickly. And I know Veeva was very good in giving away engage remote meeting licenses to existing customers to get people started. But there was a massive effort from our industry to get up to speed quickly and to respond to this action. On the flip side, you may want to look at this and say, that's an awful lot of emails going out. That's an awful lot of content produced in a hurry that went out to customers. Was it the right content at the right time for the right customer? Interesting question. And again, I should say thanks to Veeva for all of this pulse data, which they make available to the industry. It's really useful. And I'm hoping Chris Wade's on the call and a number of others. Other platforms do exist, absolutely. It's just at the moment, most of my experience happens to be in Veeva, but we also work in OCE. I'd like to work in omnipresence, etc. So forgive me if I fall into the Veeva storytelling here, but that's where most of our experience sits. So again, Veeva Pulse data. On the left-hand side, we're looking at approved emails sent by reps, and on the right-hand side, engaged meetings through 2020. We did pretty well as an industry. Where are we here? This is Great Britain, 291% increase in approved emails, 194% increase in engaged meetings. And bearing in mind, there's probably a lot more remote meetings than that, because obviously Zoom, Teams, and other tools exist. But let's just have a look at that. Okay, this is now global across the way of the whole of the year. Just in case we have European guests on the call, 435% increase in emails. Look at that open rate though, 36% open rate despite that increase in emails. So maybe what I was saying earlier about, is this the right content? That's still really good open rates. And rep triggered emails get those great open rates. No surprises that events down 73%. But look at that increase in engaged meetings. And interestingly, an average meeting duration of 19 minutes. So did we respond as an industry? Yes, we did. Were all of those responses right? And were all the content shared the right content? That's up for debate. And I think we're now in a year where we're starting after a knee-jerk, well, knee-jerk's not the right phrase, after achieving business continuity solutions, maybe we need to move into excellence in this space. Okay, that was the industry response. What is the customer response? So this is the doctors.net survey that was done in last year, and I'll explain in a second why I'm looking at old data here. So this is like from March last year. I do know they're rerunning this survey right now, which will be in time for our PM Society webinars, but not for this one. The reason I'm sharing with this older data is I was going to update it, and I was doing research all over the weekend for this talk. All the figures are about the same, right? And I could have updated this, so I've got a few later quotes, but the figures work out roughly the same. This pre-COVID engagement, what percentage of our customers had seen someone from the industry in the previous 6 months? This is also pre-COVID data. And I only put this in here to say that even before COVID, there were 13% of our customers that wanted to engage remotely and not face-to-face. This is from the rather wonderful Across Health Navigator data that we get snippets of, but you can purchase into the full thing. But we used to use this to convince people pre-COVID of the value of using remote engagement. But it was quite difficult to get some of that traction going for a lot of customers. And obviously, COVID has accelerated the uptake of that space. So importantly, what's the expectation from our customers in re-engaging with us post-COVID? With the big caveat that in almost all of the surveys that have been done with customers, there's no real clear definition of what post-COVID means, right? Post-pandemic, all the rest of it. In this case, again, from the doctors.net M3 survey data, you're looking at anything from 23 to 30% of our customers not expecting to come back to face-to-face calls after COVID. Now, that could be due to personal risk. It could be due to organizational change. Our hospitals are going to encourage reps to come in and out from this point forward. We don't really know what's going to happen, so we need to be prepared for it. And then if we look at the channel shift that's gone on, so pre-COVID, the majority of our customers had a preference for, or a mixed preference for, face-to-face and remote. That has shifted completely the other way, with that 42% shifting to the internet. No surprises there. And here's an example of what I mean about the most recent data pretty much saying the same thing. This is from the Accenture's study, where 87% of HCPs want either virtual or a mix of virtual in-person meetings after the pandemic ends. So I guess the message here is it's not going to return back to normal. We all know that. there's an important percentage, whether it's 87%, 5%, 10%, there is a percentage of our customers that will no longer want to engage face-to-face post-COVID, or indeed can't engage face-to-face. So the remote space is here to stay, and it's where we need to excel. So how do we need to respond? And you're going to hear this a lot from me today, and I'm going to park it here because I'm going to come back to this in my talk. It's about enabling and empowering the multi-channel rep with the right functional content. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand back to Christine to introduce Dave, or I'll go straight back to Dave.
I think we can go straight across to Dave. Thanks, Dave. If you're ready to get your presentation, there we go. Here we go.
And just to say, if any questions, we'll park it for the end, by the way. If any questions on that data, I'm open to be challenged on it, obviously.
Yeah, I'm just going to make sure I minimize the screen here. Perfect. So I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry for a while. I've had roles in Pfizer, MSD, AbbVie, and I've been a rep as well. So I understand what the sales environment is. And over the last sort of 15 years, I have been focused on, can I improve marketing using behavioral science? I started lecturing in it, and I've noticed some common themes, especially around Salesforce material, and that's what I'm going to focus today. And specifically around behavioral science, because when you really think about it, all of marketing is trying to create a behavioral change. I'm trying to move my customer from one state to another. I want them to start buying my product. I want them to stop buying the competitor. If you're looking at patient materials, it's I want my patients to stay on therapy. There's very distinct behavioral changes that we're trying to create. And yet very few pharma companies are really leveraging the full potential of behavioral science to make that change happen. So what I'm going to do in this talk now is to break down two components that we can look at. And that is how do we define the behavioral change that we're trying to create to make it happen? And then how do we actually pull that through to make it more effective? And we'll have that distinct look at Salesforce. But before we start that, I just wanted to flag something. Before COVID, the average person saw between 4,000 and 10,000 marketing messages a day. And if you think back to last week, how many can you remember from last week? And how many actually made you do something physically different? And most people, it'll be minimal, which is quite shocking, really. And our customers are no different. In fact, they're probably busier. They've got pharma marketing on top of their day-to-day marketing. And when you actually look at the stats a bit further, only about 4% of marketing has positive sentiment. 89% of that is neutral, and 7% of that actually is negative. So most marketing is wallpaper. Most of the stuff we're pushing out to the clients is wallpaper. It's not going to get reacted to. And in the worst cases, it drives the negative behaviors. So an example of that is, if you go into a doctor's surgery before COVID, typically on the wall, you'll see a poster where it said, X number of people missed their appointment. Don't miss the appointment. It costs your appointment, it costs the NHS money. And it seems like a really logical thing to do until you start thinking, who are we targeting? The people not in the surgery. What have we just done? We've advertised to people that are compliant, telling them that people miss appointments. So as a result of that bit of marketing, more people miss their appointments. And in pharma content, I've seen patient programs where 30% of their assets were driving negative sales, and actually stopping that increased prescription length. It's just knowing what to stop and what to start. So our aim really is, can we boost your chances by using behavioral science? Because this is all about behavioral change. One other moment of truth I wanted to sort of flag to you. This is actually a definition of content marketing, one of the more radical ones. And that is, your patients don't care about you, your products or services. They're only focused on themselves. And we're going to think about that when we're thinking about creating the behavioral change, because our challenge, especially with remote selling and remote channels, is to make them care. And when I was at Pfizer and there was a team launching remote selling, they were wondering why the return on investment figures weren't great. It cost a lot of money to get people there. But at the end of the day, the essence of what was in it was the same piece of content. I'd seen the material over and over again. And I sat down with a whole lot of the senior leaders at European level at Pfizer and said, who would actually want to be phoned up to go on a video call with someone to take them through data they've seen 6 times already? So something is broken, and this is a big chunk of what we're trying to fix. And I see a key problem here. This is from a rep point of view. We have a marketing plan, and when I look at most pharma marketing plans, if I took the name off the top of it and replaced it with another brand name and gave it to them, they wouldn't really bat an eyelid. They all have the same sort of, we have an efficacy message, we have a patient message. Then there's a range of tactics, which might include the rep material. And most of the time, those tactics are, if you ask them why they're doing it, they probably will tell you it's because they did it the year before, or they need to do it. And then when you look at the account plan, everything is built bottom up. So when we're looking at from a behavioral science point of view, and we're trying to define the problem that we're trying to solve, first of all, from that marketing plan, we're trying to define specifically the behaviors that are actually going to unlock a behavioral change to unlock sales. The tactics then need to be driving that behavioral change, and it needs to be applicable in key scenarios and key accounts to make it implementable. And an example of that is, if you take a account planning or a scenario-based behavioral planning, and we are looking at a customer's behavior, often when you do that at a brand level, they look very generically and they don't pull that information through. So when they look at the current state of what they're trying to do, it just tells you what is currently going on. The behavioral planning bit is where we look, what are the opportunities to shift a behavior? And if we do that, we create new sales, and then we can define the tactics. So this piece is hugely missing in pharma marketing, especially the Salesforce material. Because if you take this to a Salesforce level, when we look at the complexity of where the customer is, there's a number of key customer scenarios. So I've just taken a simple ladder adoption as a generic example. And your brand can be in very different situations. It might have a lot of endorsement. It might have a lot of competition. It might be first to market. But ultimately, you're trying to drive a specific behavioral change with a customer. If they're not using it, I want them to use the product for the first time. If they are using it, I want them to expand that usage. And then I want to embed that usage and grow. And as a result of planning this way and actually understanding those scenarios about what is it I need to do to move the customer up, to change their behavior, you start to realize that actually I need a slightly different piece of content to actually shift the behavior. Because if you're communicating with someone that doesn't know anything about the product and someone that's been using it a while, the tactics that you would use would be very different. But at the moment, it seems to be a one-size-fits-all for a brand focus. And I'll go into a little bit more later on. So it begs the question, because fundamentally, if you are building rep tools to engage a customer in a scenario and the reps are thinking in a scenario-based approach, what does a rep actually do in the call? because that's what really you want to support the tools with. And the key thing here is, depends on who you ask. Having worked in sales and marketing, a typical marketing manager would say to me, well, I want that customer to hear my key messages, and I want to hear this clinical data. And the sales material reflects that. In reality, if you ask a sales rep, they're saying, well, we do want to sell and we want to change behavior, but we're inviting people to meetings, we're handling inquiries, we're providing resources, we're sending emails. Does my material really match the needs to help me move that customer up the scenario ladder? And it doesn't always do. And from a marketing perspective, they're so focused on key messages, it ends up being more like key message Tourette's. They're just repeating it. And key messages and pushing of information actually is an ineffective way of creating a behavioral change. There's much more powerful ways to do it. And when you actually start asking the customers, do you want to hear key messages? Do you want to be sold to? They fight against it. And when they've got COVID to deal with, what you start to realize is your product, your clinical message, your key data is completely irrelevant to them. And this is where we need to start to make it really relevant. So rather than focused on these key messages here, can we start to think about what does that actually mean to the customer? And can we start to present this information, the same information, in a clear story that's actually going to drive the behavior change? And to a customer, where we can be relevant is, how does that data mean that that healthcare professional can manage their patients better? And if you're focused on the customer in a way there, it actually boosts trust and it boosts the effectiveness of your content. But we're naturally driving the content in the same way that we've always done. And when you look at, you might challenge this sell piece, but often when I go into a brand team and say, what is the average length of your call? And they might say 5 minutes, and you'll find there's 30 pages in a core flow. So it's impossible to get through that core story, and it starts to become unmanageable. And especially when you're, if you look at the selling models that you're looking at, that you're teaching the reps to use, is your material aligned to it? Especially when you're spending a lot of money on maybe STEM audits to see whether your reps are selling properly. No one is really challenging the material to say, does this enhance a sell or does it make it more difficult to sell? And at the end of the day, we want to make that behavioral change happen over anything else. So going back to, reps have a series of tools. And again, you can look at what is the value proposition of those tools. So a remote sale could be used ideally to follow up from meetings and organize meetings. But at the moment, it's a very push clinical sell at the moment in the content, which makes it very difficult for the customer to either do a sequential sell. So if I do one of those calls again, will I get different data? Companies really struggle to come up with anything refreshing and new to say. So a change of the value proposition there might really help optimize and plan the content, because at the heart of this, content is king. And what we're going to now focus on is, can we make that content as impactful as possible? But from a planning perspective, a behavioral planning perspective, you're trying to drive specific behavioral changes. We have to put it into context of the customer. It's got to have value. It's got to be relevant. It's got to be engaging. It's got to be a good experience, especially in the remote channels. Otherwise, people will stop engaging. So we'll look at now about optimization of that material, and also using the material, throwing how to make that content sing with the customer to make it more effective. Then we can also look at the behavioral science behind selling in a certain scenario to make it more likely happen. So I'm just going to look at some core principles so you can actually feel the behavioral science, and then I'll explain how that affects content. So this is an actual photograph. When you first see it, you go, wow, something's wrong. It actually does get all your attention. And then you actually solve it and realize she's holding a mirror, which is great. But in a pharma material, what you see is the equivalent of that is a load of graphs. So when I present that graph here, immediately, because there's movement on the graph, all your attention goes to it because it appeals to your primal brain. Again, movement can be used to distract or to focus attention. So sometimes you'll see movement used and it actually has a negative effect on the impact of your material. But presenting that graph there means that a doctor looks at it, doesn't know how to interpret it. They're looking at the legend, they're looking at the title, they're looking at the chart, see if they can make sense. And you lose the focus of that customer for about 5 seconds for them to understand it. Ideally, if you're going to show graphs in a cell, it makes sense to sort of almost introduce it first, and then bring in the evidence, the graph to support that. So it's nothing new. So you use the graphs to enhance the conversation rather than it being the full topic of conversation. When it comes down to consumption of content as well, so I see a lot of focus on getting a lot of material out. I wanted to give you an example here. So if you put eye tracking on people and then show them adverts, what you realize is it doesn't matter what text is there, everyone has a primal brain and gets drawn to faces. So normally attracted to eyes. So that means that's your first focal point of attention on a page. So if you put headlines above it, people won't read it, which might be a good thing or a bad thing. Again, people don't tend to read content. They tend to skim read it. And especially in a call, when you're flashing something at a customer, they're not going to be able to read all the nuances or all the detail. And the optimal reading age for the general public now is so an 8-year-old could read it. Not because people can't read higher. It just means that it's much easier to consume quicker and effectively. If you increase the engagement rate in different forms of content, you see content engagement drop off quite quickly. But knowing how to apply behavioral science means that if I make one adjustment and change the baby, from a psychology point of view, you look at eyes, then look where eyes are looking, and you can dramatically change focus and attention of content. If the baby was looking the other way, all your attention will be drawn away from the text. So there's certain little cues that you can start to add in to boost the power of your content with no cost, just by applying behavioral science. Then the next thing I want you to think about is, right, how do we start to make decisions? Because we have, look, Daniel Kahneman came up with this principle that we have two forms of decision making. We have a system one brain, which is 90% of our decisions. Our decisions are mostly done on autopilot. It's based on a habit, and it's related to our primal brain, just an instinctive decision, or an emotional brain, which I'll show you an example in a second. And the other one is the rational brain. And most people don't like to use it because it takes a lot more energy. So everyone prefers to work on autopilot if you can make it a decision easy for them. So by default, all your customers will be using their system one brain to make decisions about patients, even though when you ask them, they'll post-rationalize it and say, we're using our primal brain. But an example of where you're presenting things in a rational way, but it might even come out in a negative way. An example of that is, you've probably seen these adverts on cigarette packets where you've got horrible pictures. From a rational point of view, this is going to scare people off ever trying having another cigarette, because most of the time people aren't new smokers, they're existing smokers. But when you actually analyze this, and they put people in MRI scanners and actually monitored the emotional reaction to this, it had a huge emotional reaction, which is also the same part of the brain which is linked to craving. So that advert there, or similar advert, actually increased cravings in people that smoke. So it has a negative effect. So often the material you think you're presenting in a rational way, you have to look at it in a few different lenses to really understand the impact of your content. Okay, I know we're running out of time soon. So I just want to make you think about memories, because a lot of the brand teams I speak to, one of their key concerns is, I want a big recall of my key messages, which again, recall isn't of key messages doesn't necessarily make it a powerful thing. It helps to make you think about, how do we actually store and use memory? So memory isn't like a video recording. You don't record it once and that's it. Every time you think about something, you replay that memory in your head and it becomes your new memory. But we actually encode our memories in stories. And often what you want to do is embed a trigger, if you can, to make them think about your products at the right moment. The more emotion you can get into your story, it sort of builds in that, it makes that memory stronger. And also you can link to a physical behavior. So Kit Kat did an amazing job saying, have a break, and immediately you think, have a Kit Kat. So every time someone mentions have a break, they think of their product. But when I look at how consumable the content is to actually make it stick in people's heads, most pharma content is actually relatively forgettable. And when you look at a bit of educational psychology, this is by Edgar Dale, if you present information to people, you give them graphs, you give them a whole lot of stuff information, they will have a 10 to 20% recall rate the next day. Over time, you completely forget it even happened. You completely forget the data. If you make that information tangible, make it relevant to the person, and even simulate how they could use that drug with their patients, make it really tangible, you move it from a very passive engagement to an active engagement, and you can get up to about a 90% recall rate of your content. So what we're actually best doing from a memory perspective is helping, not rather than just present the information, is to start to make your content tell a tangible story about how that can be relevant and valuable to the customer within the sales material. And then you'll start to see it much more impactful, and you will start to see how the customer values it significantly more, and it's going to be more impactful. So just a few more things. When people make decisions, most of the time they will go to a default, but if you give them a decision they've got to make for the first time, like a wine list, most people don't know how to make the decision. They've got cues there and all the information they could ever wish for on this page, but most people, unless they're a complete wine buff or an alcoholic, haven't necessarily tried all the wines. So they'll tend to look at the year and go, well, I've no idea whether it's a good year or a bad year, but I think older's better. They might pick out a country or a grape, but at the end of the day, most people go on price. People don't want to be seen as cheap. So the most popular choice are the second and third one on the way down the list. But if you know how to manipulate choice and manipulate how you do the content, you can alter decisions. So if I did one thing here and flip the menu over, people are anchored at a higher price, start reading down, they've got exactly the same information, and they tend to buy 2 to 3 spaces higher. So with no cost, instantly, I've increased return on investment for this restaurant. but the same sort of applies when you look at other principles as well, especially in pharma. So if I wanted someone to have the Albarino and I started to apply some evidence-based influence models, and I applied authority and said the Albarino has won awards, more people choose it. The biggest predictor of human behavior is what other people do, social proofing. So if I said the Albarino is our most popular, more people will choose it. Scarcity, if you said there's only one bottle left and actually it's our most popular and it's won all these awards, more people are more likely to buy it. So it's not necessarily what you're trying to say, but how you say it to increase influence, because this really works well in a pharma presentation of material. And when you look at these influence factors here, people buy from things they like. So that liking works. And that's why the essence of a rep works when they go in. They're consistently providing valued service, inviting them to meetings. So there's a care of duty there. And from a reciprocal behavior, if I'm nice to you, you're nice back to me. So a lot of the time, reps work on those top 3 principles. That's the reason why people buy from them. And we can leverage them more within sales material and bring that out so people understand that there's an obligation. Well, it's an unwritten obligation that if I've given you something, invite you to a med ed program, there's an obligation back. It's built into our psyche. The final point I'm going to make here is when I show you this slide here, all your attention goes to the red man. And this is a form of psychology called Gestalt, which means that you're designed to look out for things that stand out. Anything you've seen before, you tend to ignore. So if your attention's going to that red man, it means it pretty much gives you the majority of focus and attention of that customer. The reason why I brought this slide up here is there's been a trend over the last few years for content factories to churn out templated material. And what you're doing there is creating more boring content for the customer to feel like they can ignore. And often they've lost that nuance of what makes content special. And there's an element of how do we make this impactful? How do we make this stand out that you should be thinking about with every piece of material? And it makes your sales material, especially your remote selling material, stand out that they may want to do the experience again.
Mark, you've just got another 3 minutes or so. Just giving you a heads up.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say, right, what we've got really is I can evaluate content from the behavioral science that I mentioned. There's a whole range of them. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is we can give a score and tell you, right, how well you're performing, but that allows you to then, we can make actionable recommendations on how to improve it before it goes live. And then that's how you can boost your performance. But the reason why I'm specifically bringing it up here is actually in the digital awards this year, we're going to be evaluating all the award entries to give a behavioral science score and a recommendation feedback. So I can highly recommend you entering this year, and I'm sure James will second that. And that's really an opportunity to understand how your material compares versus everyone else. So in a nutshell, I want you to remember 3 things, because our memory works in chunks of 3 or 4 maximum. If you can do anything, start to think about behavioral planning in scenarios, about how you want to shift specific behavioral changes with specific customers at specific times and how to make that happen. Then optimize your channels, especially your rep selling materials, to make that change happen. Don't think about, I have this channel, I need to produce content for it. Think about creating that behavioral change. And the most important thing for the customers, for you and everything else is focus on measuring and increasing quality. and then you will start to see a big boost in your Salesforce material performance. So, and if you've got any questions, feel free to speak to me at the end, and my details are here if you want them. Okay.
It's fantastic, Dave. That's really good, really interesting, amazing stats and what have you. That's yeah, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions at the end. So now we'll jump back to James. You're on mute.
Yeah, just bringing up my presentation. Thank you, Christine. And just to slightly worry, because Dave says, we remember things in threes. I've got probably a lot to share here. Need to remember way more than three, so take good notes. But just, Dave, I've not heard your presentation before. I know we've engaged several times. I'm really pleased there's a good, strong overlap in what I'm about to talk about, which is really pleasing. There's a couple of things that maybe I need to work on based on what I've heard today in terms of our recommendations. But it was really interesting, and I will definitely second the PM Society Awards. So I'm the leader of the Digital Interest Group along with Sam Peigel from MSD, and I'm on the Digital Awards and the main awards judging panel. And we're really excited to have Dave and Markify looking at all of the entrants. And having been, this is my first year as a judge, last 2 years, I've been a judge. And I really would encourage you all thinking of entering. It really is a proper evaluation process we go through. And I know from those that have won their first awards, it can be a significant game changer for your business. So please do consider that. Right, sales pitch for the PM Society Awards over. Let me get to my content. So pull this up. Hopefully it's going to go into full screen. And let me just move this up out of the way. Right, okay. So second part of what I'm going to be talking about. So Dave talked about the content in terms of the behavioral change you're looking to achieve. At 28B, we don't really do content. We consult on how to optimize the platform, optimize the content for the platform you're going through, Veeva and other platforms. Brand strategy, brand key messaging, that's the job of agencies, creative agencies and brand teams with input from people like Dave. But let's say you've got your brand content going. How can you flex it, optimize it for the platforms that are available to you? So, like I've said before, I think it's all about enabling and empowering the multi-channel rep with the right functional content. I'll explain what functional content is. This was just put out by Veeva recently. This is the preliminary findings from the Pulse Data 2021. This was the increase in commercial content on Vault over the last year. So by going remote, there's been this huge increase in content, but is it the right content? Here's the ranked growth in reps sent emails. So, I mean, this is a huge amount. I almost shared this just to show how seriously Europe takes the summer holidays. When you see that massive drop in August, but again, we've responded well as an industry. We've created this content, and as Dave's looked into, there's lots of ways that content can be improved, etc. But how do we maximize it in the platforms? And there's that quote: 60% increase in commercial content on Vault in the last 6 months. And for anyone in agency land or brand team land that's on this call, you probably feel like that's all your own content. It's been an incredibly hard few months as we've been creating this content. But again, is it the right content? Okay. Brief context setting for what we mean when we talk about multi-channel rep. So this is the rep in the center. And the platforms like Veeva provide all these touch points that you can create for your customer, from face-to-face or remote detailing. And I actually put those two together. And I should also say at this point, Dave and I might have brought you together under false pretenses, because most of what we're talking about is valid in face-to-face, as in sitting opposite someone at a desk, as it is remote. But I will pick out a few of the tidbits for remote. And I think Dave already mentioned there's a few things where it's harder to achieve when you're going remote, so you need to focus more on it. But when you look at what these platforms can achieve and linking up all of these different aspects and touch points you can create for your customer, it's really about orchestrating those touch points and those customer engagements. And at the heart of that is content. But also, you'll see I've added in there the effectiveness dashboards. So I'm going to briefly show you today, if I have time, how the analytics that you're gathering within your CRM and CLM from the CLM materials can inform the rep to be more effective in call and between calls. So what do we mean? Well, functional content. So why are we going to bother with sales aids? Because if we get it right, you can see a 71% improvement in STEM healthcare's measure of an effective outcome, which is a good sell outcome. That is, you have achieved behavioral change, or a customer has agreed to behavioral change in that call. Where does this STEM healthcare data come from? Pre-COVID data, but very briefly, the red you're looking at here is no materials used, and no surprises here. If you don't use anything, you don't get much in terms of good sell outcome. What about paper? That's in gray. Okay, you get 26% of calls resulted in a good sell outcome. The pink is paper under glass. That's pretty much a not very interactive PDF on an iPad or wherever it might be. 21%. Interestingly, that's a lower outcome than paper. But the green is where we start to get interesting. The pale green is there's some interactivity for the rep. The dark green, and this is 2017 data, so it's old data, because STEM don't give away their data, you have to purchase it, but they do when it's old, is that 9% is where it's both interactive for the customer and for the rep as well. And I noticed in Dave, I can't remember who you said, who created that funnel, but you talked about that top percentage. It was something that stimulates me, but then something that's personalized. And I was really pleased to see that, because a lot of what I'm showing today is based on experience, not wisdom, science, and knowledge. But what Dave has come forward through, what Dave presented really supports what we've seen through experience, as in what content we've seen worked. I just didn't know there was a science behind it until today. So what does good look like for a sales aid, whether that be in a face-to-face or a remote setting? So what I'm going to share with you are 4 columns of good behavior, and I'm going to rattle through these relatively speedily. It's something much more than a 25-minute presentation, a bit like with Dave. If any of this grabs your interest and you want to talk about it afterwards, I'm very happy to do so. But what does good look like? It's focused. So interesting, I'm again really pleased to see this, Dave, is too often we see sales aids that are not sales aids. They are campaigns on an iPad. What you produce for the reps needs to align to the sales process. So that is assessing your customer, aligning the content to those needs, and then closing against those needs and the insights that you've gained. Shouldn't be really looking at more than 5 brand objectives, and that can result in, and this is from experience, that in a primary care setting, you want no more than 5 to 10 core slides. In secondary care, 10 to 20. So whenever I present this to a brand team, there's like a shocked silence. How can I possibly fit all of my content into so few slides? Well, we're not talking about those are the only 5 to 10 slides. It's about, for that customer, where they are on the adoption ladder and the segment they belong, those are the 5 slides or the 10 slides that will have the most impact with that customer. The next time you see that customer, it's probably not exactly the same 5 or 10 slides. Just as Dave said, it's not about the same content, sort of slamming it against the doctor's head time and time again. It's about evolving the conversation and being there at the right. And if we get that right, you can see a 2 to 4 times increase in good sell outcome. This came from a project we worked with STEM Healthcare on, where we were looking at theoretical improvements in sales aids. And if you got those theoretical improvements, how would that look in terms of all of the audits they've done for pharma companies, and what would they expect to see in terms of a return for that investment in making your sales aid shorter and easier to navigate? And that is, if the reps deliver all key messages, 2 to 4 times increase. And then it's kind of a bit of a tautology here, if that's the right phrase, that, it's the thing that I see the least of in the sales aids that we do, and we have a really, really wide view of the industry, is there just never seems to be a close. There's always a summary slide, which is great, but where's the call to action? Where's the commitment to behavioral change? Especially when you've gone to the effort to understand your customer, you've gone to the effort to align your content. Why can't we use the system to bring that back together for a close that's personalized? That was the one right at the top of that funnel that Dave showed, where you get the most recall. And if you get that competitive closing right, you can see an 18 times increase in GSO. That's no surprise, because a GSO, a good sell outcome, is a commitment to behavioral change. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy there. Interactive. And this is where I'm going to pick out how much more important this is for a remote engagement. Encouraging that emotive two-way dialogue is key to any sales. We've just talked about that. And in fact, I think the stat is here. This is pre-COVID, that establishing that two-way dialogue delivers a 1.5 to 4 times increase in good sell outcomes. I've been observing rep calls over the last year in response to COVID, when they've been getting used to engage. And it started off, or other remote platforms, started off rep to rep training calls. And then as customers start to come back online, we've observed in those calls, and even the best reps out there are falling into a tell cell. Why? Because maybe the doctor doesn't have the camera turned on, and if they do, they're a tiny little thumbnail up here. You're missing all the non-visual cues that you get in a face-to-face setting. And it's very easy to slip into that slide after slide after slide. You get to the end of the call and it'd be talking to the reps afterwards and like, do you realize you didn't ask a single question of your customer? So let's use the content. Let's create content that enables the rep or encourages the field teams to punctuate their conversations, but also to stop and assess their customers. So that's identifying the clear source of business. What patients are we talking about? And when we talk about that patient, what's your go-to choice? What are you using? When you use it, what treatment goals are you looking to achieve? And out of those treatment goals, which is the hardest one to achieve? Which one are you struggling with? Because once I understand that, I can align my content either programmatically through branching sales aids or just really good navigation that allows the rep to quickly and easily draw that red thread through the most appropriate content. And then let's bring all that learning to the end in a close message or a close slide that brings that through. We're talking about this patient where you would have chosen this competitor to achieve these treatment goals. But on everything I've showed you now, will you be willing to prescribe, or will you now prescribe? There's your behavioral change you're looking for. The next column is impact. So I get a lot of challenge on this since we've gone remote. So let me give some context. Too many of the things that we're asked to build are cluttered. They're just full of tiny text. And yet there's definitely a compliance issue here. Everyone wants everything shoved on that page. Always trying to encourage, challenge your compliance teams about what can be displaced into a pop-up to free up that space. Why? Because pre-COVID, when I was sitting opposite a customer, even with an iPad Pro at 12.5 inches in diagonal screen, and they're sitting the other side of the desk, can they genuinely see that chart? Can they genuinely read what you're showing them? And people are like, yeah, but now we're remote. Everyone's got nice big monitors. And no, I'm afraid that's not true. We know there's a good significant percentage of customers that access remote sales calls on their mobile phone. So can they see that content? How big is it? Okay, let's even dismiss that one and say, we don't do calls on mobiles. If a doc's on a mobile, we'll say, actually, can you call back when you're on a browser? So they've got a nice big monitor like I've got here, which I look off screen, it's because I've got it here. Maybe they haven't got a very nice monitor. What if it's an old monitor in a hospital they're using? What if they got their window reduced to a small size, etc.? So it's still valid. And actually, when you look at the ability for remote platforms to share content, the quality is degraded. So it's really important to make sure that stuff's just simply readable. We're also going to have a new challenge when we do go back to face-to-face. You know, you're not going to be sitting next to your customer behind the desk. You're going to be 2 meters away with a mask on, and your iPad maybe is going to be sitting in the middle of the desk, which is why at 28B we're working on voice-activated slide navigation so that the rep consider the distance and ask for the slides to move on. So there's interesting new challenges. So I think whether it's face-to-face or remote, you know, thinking about your UX and your layout is really important. And again, looking to what Dave says about where are the eyes going on the page, etc. Not our area, but I think that would be important. Fingertip objection handling, I'm going to talk about that in a sec. Animation, really pleased to see what you said about charts, Dave. I'm a great believer that animated charts don't really sell a drug, right? But they do help a rep tell a story. So for instance, when you present the axes of a chart empty, and let's just say at 12 weeks, your product starts to separate from placebo or competition, you tap and it grows to 12 weeks. It allows the rep to talk about that first point where you're better than the competition. And then you tap and it grows to 24 and to 48. It's helping you tell that story, and it's allowing the HCP to consume that information in a way where they're not feeling challenged and disconnected. I won't go on to the other aspects here, but think about the impact they have, not just from a behavioral science point of view, but just a pure and simple layout, and is it visible? This is my favorite bit. This is the integrated bit. These platforms that we've got available to us now, such as Veeva and Omnipresence and OCE, etc., are all about integration, opportunity, and data. So are you maximizing, the Veeva ecosystem in this case? You know, is it empowering the multi-channel rep? So for such things as, have you got Veeva approved emails or rep triggered emails integrated into the flow? Can you launch that from within a sales aid to respond to a customer question? Are you sharing this data back with the field team? either in system through something like My Insights in Veeva, or through ClickView or ClickSense or whatever platform you're using. Those analytics are there to create this virtuous cycle of reps seeing that they're getting benefit from using this CLM material. They're understanding their customers more, and they can be more effective in the next sales call. So what does good look like for a sales aide, both in a remote setting and face-to-face? It's focused, it's interactive and engaging. It's fully integrated into the platform, and the reps want to use it, and they can do so by effectively delivering all the core key messages in order and establishing that two-way dialogue with the HCP and aiming for that competitive close for behavioral change. It's the hardest thing to do as a rep, is to ask for behavioral change. Will you now prescribe this drug? So can we design content that helps them think in that way and helps them express that? I'm now going to touch on rep-triggered emails because they are as equally important as the sales material. They are the lifeblood that joins things together within a system. Why do we want to bother it? Well, a well-structured rep-triggered email with the right tone of voice can achieve a 35 to 60% open rate with a 6 times industry average click-through. They're a really powerful tool for getting through to our customers. Why? It's because they're coming from a trusted person. They're coming from someone they know. So what I'm going to talk about today is the importance of making sure that when you create Veeva-approved emails to encourage remote engagement, that they're the right tone of voice and the right sort of content for reps to send. So what does good look like for Veeva-approved emails? Again, you're going to recognize some columns here. This is not the place and time to go through content efficiencies, but for most platforms, especially, or with my knowledge of Veeva, there are lots of ways to make use of content efficiencies, to reduce speed to market, to reduce the compliance burden, reduce cost, and reuse stuff. The only thing I'm going to focus in from this pillar today is the core suite of the emails that you should really have for all field teams. So let's just think about the most basic orchestrated customer engagement. You need access, you need consent, you need to invite them to a remote meeting. You should probably remind them the remote meeting is happening. And then where it gets really interesting for me is the in-call support, the equivalent of reaching down into the old leather pilot's bag that I used to carry around as a rep and pulling out that killer clinical trial that is to support your brand, or the dosing leave piece that you want to stick on the doctor's desk so that when they see that next patient, you get some sort of recall. And then there's the post-call nudge or follow-up. So that's your basic orchestration. And you can easily produce a simple template that can be repurposed or can be used throughout that, or a suite of them. Once produced, they're very flexible, and all you're doing is then creating the little fragments that go in there for the new content that you're going to get. What about task-orientated Veeva-approved emails? So let's just take a webinar. It seems to be the new black when it comes to our engagement with customers at the moment, and plenty out there. So again, what about save the date email? These can all be repurposed from one webinar to another. In this case, you might want to argue they may be more branded and dressed up emails because it's an event that you're trying to create excitement around. But you want to save the date, invite registration, remind them for the meeting, the webinar happens. And this is where it gets interesting. Most brand teams we work with wait until the webinar recording has been done, and then that's what they ask the reps to share. But we all know that's got a good few weeks, unless it's a pre-record between the webinar finishing and when that's been approved and ready for release. So what about a next day email that is to all those that attended? I hope you enjoyed the meeting. I'd really love to come and talk to you about it. Why? Because I think the number one output for a webinar should be the number of one-to-ones you get out the back end of it. Webinars set you context, they create curiosity, they inform. Do they sell? It comes down to the conversation with the rep where you're moved from, I'm interested, to I'm going to try and prescribe. So get those one-to-ones out as quickly as you can. And again, the emails that you produce can be repurposed from one webinar to another. And then when the sharing, the recording becomes available, then there's another touch point there that you can create. And if you use the emails right, you can have a simple drop down in there that says, I'm glad you attended the webinar yesterday. I'd really love to come to talk to you about it, versus I'm really sorry you missed the webinar. I'd love to come and talk to you about the content that we discussed, etc. So think about how one email with some simple adaptation can be used for multiple purposes. I'm not going to go on to anatomy for today. This is the one I want to really drive home. The clue is in the name. They're rep triggered emails, not head office triggered. We're not just utilizing the field team to send bulk emails. We've got Markify. We've got Marketo. We've got Salesforce Marketing Cloud for that. This is about giving the reps a suite of emails and content to share with their customers so they can orchestrate the engagement. So I always ask this of a brand team when I see something designed up by an agency that looks like a head office email that reps are being asked to send. Ask the brand team, would you send this to a customer the day after you met them? And as an example of that is the greeting. It's a really simple thing. So Dave and I have known each other now for a good few months. And let's just say Dave says, after this email, he drops me a quick email to say, well, we have a conversation. He says, you know what, James, I really enjoyed those slides. Could you just ping them over to me as a PDF? If I then sent an email to Dave that said, dear Mr. David Pinnington, and it said, yours sincerely, James Harper at the bottom, he would think I'd gone a little insane, right? No one writes that sort of email to people they know. And unless it's a brand new rep or a brand new doctor, they've known that doctor for a while. So if they call that doctor John, hi, John, it's good to see you, John. And the only option they've got to send them an email is, dear Dr. Jonathan Smith. They might not send it. It's a really uncomfortable thing. So that's the simplest challenge I can offer here is, would you send it to someone you know? And if not, it's not a rep-triggered email, right? A rep-triggered email comes from the rep. Uptake and utilization. There's tone of voice is key. I've already said that. I don't think you'll see great uptake from field teams where you're forcing them to use the content that doesn't sound like them and will rub up against how they communicate with doctors. The other one is training. It's not that it's relatively simple to get your head around how Veeva approved emails work, but it's important to put the training in place and not just assume. The other thing is to support reps on planning touch points. I'll come on to that in a sec. But for me, uptake and utilization is about the right content for the right customer. So here's an example of the sort of framework we use when we help brand teams think. Across the top, we've got our adoption ladder, and I think you have something similar, Dave. So unaware, trial user, regular user, advocate, whatever your adoption ladder is. And then if you've done some customer segmentation, I just picked some really simple one, confident, complacent, cautious, etc. Then do an audit of all of your content that you have. The content you've already got approved for use on Vault, but you don't have a means to distribute. So the sites that you own, so brand portals, med-ed sites, or third-party sites where you want to point customers. Do an audit, work out your content, and then you can align that content to the ones that you think will have the most impact for that type of customer where they are on the adoption ladder. And if you've tagged your content in Vault to that effect, you can track the effectiveness that sharing this content at the right time with customers is having. And you can see what content works well, because with Veeva approved email, you don't just get to see if it's been sent, it's been received, but you also get to see if it's been opened, and you get to see the click-through rate. So we can look at all of that to start to see what content is performing. This is an example of a dashboard that we're creating. It's actually a planning dashboard. So is it really a dashboard? But essentially, it's within Veeva. It sits within the My Insights framework. And what this is showing you is that if you've done that effort of saying, look, this content will impact this type of customer the most of where they are on the adoption ladder, give the means for the reps to start planning that out. A lot of us are used to doing digital personas. Well, I'm here to say, I think for the top 10, 15, 20 customers within a territory, you should be thinking about how this plans out. So what this does here is just floats to the top the most effective content for that customer type and allows the rep to drag and drop this to plan out their engagement with that customer. Okay, last one, analytics. The analytics I mentioned for the sales aids, I actually find that for reps, the analytics and the insights that Veeva approved emails give them are actually more exciting. The reason being the slides I showed a doctor are not that surprising. I was there, and I actually probably have a way through the sales aid that I usually use. So how informative is it to know what slides we use with what customer? It is. It's not that important to the rep. However, if I send an email, it's out of my control. Let's say 2 weeks after I send that email, I click to have a look at that customer and they've opened it and they clicked on the dosing card. That's a really strong buying signal. And we've actually seen a bit of this creation of a virtuous cycle where the sales team start to get almost, they really want to see when the email's been opened. There's that starting to get that excitement around analytics. And one of my missions, if you like, is to move analytics from something that reps feel are there to police them and to measure them, into something that will help them do a better job and they enjoy them. And that's what I believe a good CLM system should do for you. So what does good look like for Veeva approved emails? They're emails that reps want to send, and they want to send them to create the right touch points and share the right content with the right customer at the right time. Okay, so that was a rattle through, and I appreciate there's an awful lot there, and I've assumed quite a lot of knowledge in the background. But if it's of interest and it's interesting, we can always engage elsewhere. Now, I've got just 3 minutes to show you 3 bits of content. I might go over just a little bit, but I think we're okay. I'm just going to share my iPad now to show you what that looks like in terms of content. How are we doing on time?
You're just on the
thing. All right. Yeah. Let me show you 3 pieces because it illustrates all of this. And forgive me, there'll be people on this call who I've known for a while, and you've seen this content. In fact, make no excuses. This particular piece I'm showing you is 4 years old now, and it still gets brand teams sitting forward. And I believe it nicely illustrates lots of the point that Dave made, and certainly the ones I've made. So what we're looking at here is an opening slide for a presentation. And let's just pretend that you have a calcium bone replacement therapy. You're dominant in the adult market, but you're getting an indication, or you've just received an indication for pediatrics. So what is a critical success factor for you as a brand is to understand how your customers view the treatment of pediatrics in this area. That's really important for you as a brand team, but it's also critically important for a rep in a call. Why? Because if I am talking to a doctor that did a pediatrics rotation during their training and runs a clinic every 3rd Thursday, I can jump into why our product or why our brand is a good choice. I don't have to convince them that pediatrics is a valid patient group for this treatment. If, however, they are an old school GP and just thinks that the kids need to drink more milk and get out in the sun, I've got a job to do to convince them of the importance of this. So this slide helps you understand your customer in the moment, as well as it will inform the brand team about changes over time. And in fact, I can go a stage further, and you can ask what percentage prescribing each of those patient groups get. Now, you probably wouldn't show this data to the doctor at this point, but that's the data you can be getting back as a brand team or as an agency to understand what's happening, to track your KPI over time. Are we moving the importance of pediatrics up? Really valuable data, and it works both in call and as a marketing team. I mentioned earlier fingertip objection handling, and about enabling the reps to effectively and thoughtfully navigate through their content once they've done that alignment. So here you're seeing a classic efficacy slide, study 1, study 2. The rep is mid-flow, and the customer says, I'm really sorry, I just don't think your inclusion criteria for your clinical trial fairly represent my patient population. Let's just pretend I've selected an account here. Here you go. So what you would normally, what you don't want to do is go off down a tangent trying to find the pop-up, etc. So we call these blades, and they sit on every single efficacy slide. And it's it's just an infinite canvas of content. And it allows me to very quickly try that again. I don't think your inclusion criteria fairly represent my patient population. That's interesting, Doctor. Well, here's the inclusion criteria. Let's just go through. It does. Well, that's great. And the important thing is I'm on the same slide I was on before. I'm allowed to get back to my thread that I've already chosen to go through with you. So this is what I was saying about enabling the rep to deliver those core key messages in each sales call. Last piece I'm going to show you, there's plenty more I could, is about the integration between one part of Veeva and another. This is a pre-COVID example, so it's in-person meetings, but let's just say you've got some great positioning from NICE. You obviously want to talk about it. You obviously want to educate clinicians on what the change to their clinical practice should be if they follow these guidelines. So you say, Doctor, I haven't got time to go into it today, but we've got some great meetings coming up. Would you be interested in attending? Here's the different ones. Now, you can imagine now this is a list of webinars with a list of speakers rather than location-based in real world meetings. If I tap book here, hands-free, it runs through the Veeva approved email interface. It selects the right template, inserts the fragment for that meeting, and I can send it. Job done. I'm back to selling. Okay, so making it super easy for reps to use the Veeva approved email or rep triggered email interface that is present in all these platforms. The last thing I'll show you is about making sure that the reps can see the value of those analytics. And here we've got a My Insights dashboard. There's the 3 meetings we're talking about. If I open it up, this isn't about measurement, it's about effectiveness in your territory. You can see how many people have registered for that meeting that you're recruiting for, and you can see some other information from those emails. Not yet invited, Invited, unopened, not registered, invites accepted. 4 really clear actions as a rep. Not yet invited, I'll invite them. Unopened email, I'll send it again and I'll give them a call. Open but not registered. Was it the wrong date, the wrong chairman, the wrong topic? Can I invite them to another meeting? And then invites accepted. Great, I'll send them a reminder, even call them the day before. So you can turn this into a task-orientated dashboard that's really practical and start that process of buying reps into the value of analytics rather than they're there just to police them. Right, I'm going to stop there. I could continue for a long time, but I will stop so we can move to discussion.
That's great. Thanks very much, James. It's amazing. So if anybody's got any questions, they can either raise their hand. I think Sam's going to make it so that we can see and hear you. So I don't know if there's any questions yet in the Q&A. I'm not sure there is.
We haven't had any just yet. So if anyone does have any questions, then feel free to send those in.
Yep, we've got a few questions to ask though. And it's for Dave, really. You mentioned the PM Society Behavioural Science Award. How can a brand team or agency win? Question.
Well, the way we've set it up is we're actually going to be measuring every award entry in the healthcare professional categories. So it means that we're going to create a benchline for a benchmark for different forms of content. So we're going to analyze it, and we're going to start to tell people via the PM Society LinkedIn page the criteria were specifically what we're looking for and what good and what bad looks like. So the evaluation criteria we're looking at, some examples over the next few weeks. So it means that we'll be informing you piece by piece, but it means that everyone is consistently measured, and we're going to take the top performers, and there's going to be a Markify Behavioural Science Award category. So it means that it's unique, so it'll be particularly of interest there. Yeah.
Amazing. And what advice can you recommend to embed behavioural science then, generally?
Well, it was interesting, James's presentation there, because there's a lot of focus about pushing metrics, and it's like, well, we want to make sure that people use approved emails, or we want to make sure they do the close. So when you look at it from a behavioural science point of view, planning the experience about the behavioural changes we want to create at different points means that when I was looking at sales aids, I was looking at how I embed that call to action at the moments that rep would need it. So they want a quick close. They've got 2 minutes with a doctor. Can they, and we understand the story that they've gone through, what is the next step we want them to do to follow? So I would do the 3 things that I mentioned is start to think about the content in terms of driving behavioral change. So we know we can categorize the customers. We can, on a ladder of adoption, it's articulating that behavioral change is step 1, because that's what you're trying to make happen. And as James was talking about, it's optimizing your channels to make that work. And finally, it's optimizing the content and the quality of that content to make it really drive the behavioral changes. And that does require some change of thinking within the sales force, because often when a rep's been a long-term rep selling for however many years, they're used to a certain way of selling, and they're going to do that no matter what. So it's often we create playbooks of how to sell in certain scenarios to shift a behavior. Okay. What will be most impactful? Yeah.
Can I just ask you, just before I've seen a question, I'm sure we're going to open up. But can I just ask Dave, just an extension of Christine's point, apart from engaging with Markify, how can a brand team or agency or me learn a bit more about what's a good entry point for behavioral science? What's a good book or audio listen or something that you would recommend to get us into this thinking?
Yeah, so one of the things which, I mean, I've been looking at this topic for quite a long time now, and I speak to people about behavioral science, and before I've even spoken to them, I say, they go, behavioral science, that's really great. I then say, oh, what do you know about behavioral science? They've got no definition of it, but they believe it works. So there's certain principles. It's such a massive topic. And anyone that I know has read a book very rarely applies it. But there's certain books that are really amazing. I highly recommend Natalie Nehay's Webs of Influence, which looks very generically across all of them. And then that sort of gives you an overview, a taster. And I think that's a really good entry point.
Thank you.
Brilliant. And in this context, how does pharma compare to other sectors?
Okay, so I think when you look at the quality of the content that comes out, generally it's very, very brand centric. So we're looking at brand centricity. And when you're very brand centric, you tend to destroy trust if you look at trust models. So the industry often has a low trust rating when you look at healthcare professionals. Do they trust you? Do they feel like they're trying to influence you? And our constant promotion of key messages can actually have a negative effect. There's most of the time, other brands are very much more brand centric. Apart from when we evaluated Huawei, which had a very low trust score for some reason in their content, and that's what they were trying to build. Generally, we're probably about half the quality of a good FMCG brand in the material that we're doing, but we do have very unique scenarios. And I'm not. It doesn't really matter where we are. It's about, can we improve? And you mentioned emails, James. So one company, we were looking at their emails, and we were focused on, can we boost the quality of the emails? And we improved the quality score by about 50%, but the next open rate on those emails increased by 750%, because there's obvious errors that people were making that we can fix relatively quickly. And we also have worked with the Marketing Society to improve their emails. So that must be quite a good thing as well.
I see we've got some questions, and if we want to address those, Sam, from JB, can we bring JB into the conversation?
Yep. Let me just allow you to talk.
You don't. I'll start the ball rolling if JB's want to ask it yourself. But how can we balance the urge to create more content versus creating meaningful content that impacts on behavioural change? I just speak to that from my side. I showed how I think there's a lot of content already out there, and it's about aligning that content to the customer journey that we are looking to do that behavioural change. And then you've probably got enough content at that point. So, it's doing that exercise, seeing where the gaps are and filling those gaps, and then being brave to say, we've got enough. But that's a very simplistic view. Maybe I'll pass that back to Dave to answer about fighting that urge for just creating more and more content.
Yeah, it comes down to what I mentioned about key message Tourette's. It's one of my favorite phases. It's sort of like they keep on wanting to push their clinical message and in lots of different formats, and they feel like they need to do that. But when you talk about effectiveness, you could say, right, I'm going to develop a website. What's more effective? 1,000 people going to it and nothing happens, or 10 people go to it and 5 people buy or do something differently as a result of it. So impact is everything. So if we can try and fix one thing, I'm not trying to criticize content and say, oh, you're underperforming. I'm trying to say, this is where we are. If we did these things, the content performance will get better, the impact will get better, and everyone will be much more successful. But when I look at strategically within a brand team, the higher up you go, they actually want people to do less, but more effectively. And the lower down you get, the more they want to show that they can justify their job. So they just do lots of things. And strategically, most of the time, they have no idea what's really driving the behavioral changes. So focusing on that is a real critical challenge, but being able to benchmark the content quality is probably the best start, because it gives you a benchmark to work against.
I think that's an interesting point there, which is what we saw certainly in the middle of last year when we got up to speed with content, is content burn went right up. So there was a feeling that as a representative, I don't have access to my customers, but I need to be seen to be doing something. So I'm going to send a lot of emails. I'm going to share a lot of content. And that kind of drove to, oh my God, the 6 months plan of emails that we've got have gone in 6 weeks. So we got into this thing of we need more and more content. So that switch really comes from knowledge and confidence, in my view, and proper planning, rather than, we've got what content is going to make a difference. And JB also asks, how do you evaluate content performance leading to good sell outcomes? I can only talk from an analytics point of view. It's tagging your content. It's planning your analytics, tagging your content, and then looking at it. We always recommend from the point that you launch a campaign, it's 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months. But importantly, especially in secondary care and rare disease space, where it's not a lot of data because there's not a lot of reps and there's not a lot of customers, you need to qualify any data with input from the field team and preferably with customers.
From my perspective, I see a lot of people monitoring channels. Oh, they had a rep email. They had this interaction with the customer. They're not really saying, well, my customers changed their behavior. What was it about that content that worked well? And they don't say, well, was it a key opinion leader speaking in a video? I have no idea. That made the difference. What is the quality of the content that's going out there? So it's such a complex scenario, but one of the things is I've noticed as soon as you start to improve the quality of the content, to align it to a selling model, allow flexibility for the reps, because the reps aren't presenting, often they're having a conversation. So it's how do you move it away from this telltale to an interaction, and how do I leverage the data and the information in the call in the most effective way? And I've got a feeling that most of the marketing I've seen tends to be a bit more generic. It tends to be they need to hear this information, and there's a big gap between the what the reps need and what the content is. So the way I started off by going on about the brand plan, if you are trying to drive that brand plan through, it needs to be executed at a local level. And at the moment, there's a disconnect. So we can start to scenario plan the content at a tactical level to make it really impactful. But at the moment, there's a big gap in Pharma.
Okay.
JB actually said, very well said, Dave. Unfortunately, organizations are driving content speed without any impact criteria in place. We've got a couple more questions from Chris Bartley. So I don't know if we can get Chris Bartley to speak, or whether we read out his question. Are you able to get him to?
Hi guys, can you hear me?
Hey Chris.
It's Chris Bartley calling from Surrey. With a quick
Long time
question.
listener, first time caller, eh?
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, So I was just wondering, in terms of understanding what's most effective, particularly based around people's behaviours. I'm just wondering whether it's more effective to look at, say, sales, and look at the rep who has the highest sales, and try to identify what it is that they do that's different, that's giving that and generating those high sales, or whether it is to work kind of forward towards that in terms of looking at your content, your training, behavioral science theory, etc., and trying to apply that across all of the reps and force them into that model. So I just wonder, because often you see massive differences between reps who are using the same tools, have the same training, etc. So I was just interested in the panel's thoughts on that.
Yeah. I personally think that, because I think when I was at AbbVie, we noticed when a rep went out and sold on one of the products, sales went down. It's like, am I still using that product? And then it acted as a trigger to change your behavior. So I think there's a mixture of territory. So territories grow on their own. You'll have there's things out of our control. There's things in our control, and actually, it's a combination of everything. It's not one thing, but the more dimensions you look at stuff, the more it helps give you a complete answer. It's not just one of those things, because if the reps can't sell using material, then it doesn't matter, and they annoy the customer. It doesn't matter how good the content is. So it's all in the context there. And also, there is a sort of preference thing for people, but it's there's a lot of data on what do customers prefer data in, and it really does depend on the experience you're giving. It's like saying, what's your preference for getting the news? Well, I listen to it on the TV. I look at it on my phone first thing in the morning. You have multiple intents, but it's when you focused on changing a behavior, you have a common set of problems. And when you create a common set of problems, how do I change a customer in a scenario? You can start to collaborate with the reps to say, what worked for that rep to change the behavior? Can I capture that? Because there's part information there to help them sell. What tools worked? So what content was working most effective? And then let's look at the quality of that content to see what worked, and also look at the channels and how they view stuff. So I think it's a combination.
And I guess just James,
yeah.
Do you know? Are you allowed to record rep calls with doctors so that you can go back to them? So you could identify the sales data posthumously, and then you could look back across those recordings to identify some of the behaviours that Dave talked about. I mean, is that do you have to have specific consent to do that?
So I think that's going to be company specific, right? So there's, is it market research? Is it, what are you using it for? In fact, the last conversation I had with the GDPR lawyer about this, where we were collecting data within a sales aid, was if, as long as you don't change your relationship or behavior with that customer based on those insights, then it's fine without permissions, right? So if you were to do some survey within a sales aid about what a customer preference was, and then you don't invite them to an event based upon that, then that actually qualifies as needing further permissions. But I'm not a GDPR lawyer. What I was hoping that Phil from Bionicle would join us in the discussion group, but unfortunately he's on holiday this week. But I know that at Bionicle are actually recording calls and using AI to pick out keywords and to start looking at, which is really exciting, right? Obviously, you need the behavioral science to feed into that research, but the fact that they can do that, I have no idea what they're doing from a permissions base. So small punt for our meeting on the one after yours, Chris, for the PM Society, which we've shifted now into the second slot. Phil's presenting on some of that in that session, so that might be interesting to talk to him about it. Can I just saw a question? Sorry, Chris, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Probably
Thanks, everyone.
I think it's just a quick one from the anonymous attendee. Behavioural science is poorly understood when it comes to HCPs. I didn't want to go into a great deal of depth on this one because it's not my area, but Dave, are you aware of behavioural science research specifically around HCPs in the industry, or just HCPs and patients?
There's a lot of stuff around patient, and some of the research I've done with patients as well, looking at why does a patient drop off. It's not necessarily material, it's some things like psychographics, their personality driving, their ability to cope, and anxiety. When it comes down to HCPs, it's almost like we think that they are different beasts, different creatures. But the behavioral science piece is a neutralizing piece. It's how people work. So it doesn't really matter. The context matters, but the principles of behavioral change doesn't change based as long as you're dealing with a human. It doesn't really make any difference. So there's so many little tools and tricks you can embed in there to make a behavioral change happen. I'll give you a question here. When I look at most brand plans, and they do a load of med ed, which is like well away from the decision point. They do rep activities, which is away from the decision point. The most important influential point in that patient journey is the point of prescription. And do we create any materials to influence that at that moment? No. Could you? Yeah, very easily done. But it's ignored. And that's because when you produce information in a way that can influence a decision point, but is fair and balanced, it requires behavioral science. And brand teams are so used to just pushing out the same promotional materials, saying, well, they've got to hear this clinical paper, they've got to hear these key messages, they've got to do this. And actually, when you look at it from an influence point, you've got a huge range of opportunities, and embedding trigger points in that point of prescription to make them think, oh yeah, that reminds me of that patient, instantly can change the difference between a barrage of sales or them just slowly trying your product. And when you ask about med-ed and you do ad boards with doctors and you say, what would you like for med-ed? And they'll go, oh, I want training on this. But if you suddenly say, would you like some tools to help you manage your patients better, to explain things to them? It's roughly the same topic, but they can't get enough of that. And if I can control that content at that point and embed it in there, that is a really huge influential point that no one is really touching in pharma.
Cool. We've got another question from JB. Is JB able to talk it through? No?
Yep.
No.
Is it about the playbooks? Yeah, I've created a few playbooks, and it's what I wanted to do is say, like, and what's interesting, I think James said it with sales material and 5 slides, and the realization that do reps actually use your slides. With one brand team, they had about 300 slides in their sales aid.
Oh my God.
I all the material around the room, and I said to the reps, right, put an X on a slide you've never used or have no intention of using ever again. And we were left with 20 slides. So that's the reality between the user and what the marketing want to say. And then when you start to create scenarios and say, how would we use the material in this scenario? And how would we open the call? And how would we make that more effective? And how would we drive the behavioral change? I want to capture what reps are saying that's working really well in that scenario. We can filter it, and then we can co-create it. And also you can say, right, if I go back in the call in a month's time, and I don't want to say the same thing, how would I use the material? So you create these user guides in a playbook, which can work in a very, very different way. And it's all designed to enhance a conversation and dialogue. And actually, if you're talking about key scenarios, if no one's actually doing the close, if I can physically bake in a close that I can invite you to a meeting, or actually, can I show you this resource and it's linked to an approved email? If I can bake that into the sales aid, more people, significantly more people click on it when we've embedded it. But it requires a sort of different way of thinking when it comes to planning material.
I think this is a really, really interesting point about massive fan of co-creation, but with that behavioral science aspect. And I think speaking to Chris Bartley's point earlier about what are the habits and behaviors of the best reps, and that's one of the things that STEM do get right, which is when they look at the top performers, what are they doing, what can we learn from that, and how can that be shared? The top performers are likely to be naturals when it comes to behavioral science, right? They're gonna have some of those basic things right, and they'll actually almost be working against the content to get around it in order to achieve that. It'd be really interesting to work with some particularly high performing reps to look at, with you on board, Dave, to look at it from a behavioral sciences. What are they doing right? I think that'd be fascinating, and then creating a playbook out the back of that would be a really interesting project.
And just one more point on that. So when I was at MSD, we're looking at some sales aids. Typically, it took between 6 to 8 months to do a sales aid, and I was trying to embed Scrum in the approach as an agile way of doing it. So we created a rapid prototype within a month. And by the second month, I think we had 4 different versions had gone out because we'd done small iterations from feedback. So rather than just in that planning phase, the agile approach in execution as well means that you can do refinement. And I think when you spend 6 to 8 months doing a sales aid, you don't want to look at it for another year or so until you have to do it again, and then they rebuild it. Whereas if you look at it as a continuous improvement exercise, that's when you can get a huge amount of value.
Cool. Right, I think we answered all the questions. I think we've covered most of these, haven't we? Just to let you know that we are recording tonight, so we will have this recording session up on our YouTube channel in the next few days. So keep your eyes peeled for that, and we'll let you know when it's up. I don't know if you want to add anything else, James, before we kind of wrap up.
Other than say thank you, Christine and the team, as always, for doing all the background work on this, the promotion and the everything else. It's always really, really appreciated. And to Dave and to Gary, who's remained silent, but is a partner with Dave, was on this for joining us. I found it absolutely fascinating and validating for a lot of the things that I talk about, whilst challenging for a few others. So
no, it's been really interesting. Thanks, guys. It's been amazing. So thanks very much, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks. Bye.